Hi, I'm Abe Socher, editor of the Jewish Review of Books, the quarterly print and web magazine of Jewish criticism, culture, and ideas. Welcome back to JRB Conversations. Today I'm speaking with Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy, who have written a book together about Natan's life as a Soviet dissident and also as an Israeli politician and leader. The book is called Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People, and it expands on and carries forward the story of that classic memoir he wrote, Fear No Evil. Natan Sharansky was, of course, the most prominent Soviet refusnik and a leader in the struggle for human rights in the 1970s and 80s. As such, he was continuously surveilled, harassed, threatened, and interrogated by the KGB. After his formal request to make Aliyah, Mr. Sharansky was quickly arrested on really transparently phony charges of treason and espionage, charges which carried the possibility of the death penalty. He was quickly convicted in a Soviet court and served 9 years in the Gulag, much of it in solitary confinement. Following massive public campaigns spearheaded by his wife Avital, who had been able to make Aliyah shortly after their marriage, campaigns on which many of you no doubt participated, Natan Sharansky was released in 1986 and was finally able to make Aliyah. Shortly after he arrived in Israel, Mr. Sharansky established the Zionist Forum to help Soviet immigrants in their absorption. In the 90s, he followed up on that by establishing the Yisrael Ba'aliyah Party and served in 4 successive Israeli governments as minister and deputy prime minister. From 2009 to 2018, he served as chairman of the Jewish Agency. In addition to being the recipient of Israel's highest honor, the Pras Yisrael, or Israel Prize, he is also one of only 4 non-US citizens to be a recipient of both the Congressional Gold Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The others are Mother Teresa, Pope John II, and Nelson Mandela. His co-author, Gil Troy, is an award-winning historian at McGill University, though he, like Sharansky, now lives in Jerusalem. In addition to his many books on 20th century American history, he is also the editor of The Zionist Ideas, Visions of the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, Tomorrow, which is an updating of Arthur Hertzberg's classic anthology. Gil, Natan, thanks very much for coming. It's so great to have you here.
Pleasure to be with you. Erev Tov from Jerusalem.
So I thought I'd start. I really wanted to have this conversation right before Pesach because, at least for me, as a child in the 70s, my family, along with thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of others, spoke about you, Ida Nudell, and other refuseniks at the Seder table, rallied around about Pesach. I was mentioning to you just before that when my wife Shoshana heard that we were talking, she ran downstairs and found her, I guess by now probably 40-year-old Free Soviet Jewry button from probably from Northern California. I mean, your story, the story of Soviet Jewry, is the great story of Exodus and redemption in our time. And so I guess the first thing I wondered, you talk a little bit about it in your book, is what do you tell your children and your grandchildren at the family seders?
Well, thank you, Abe. It's a pleasure to be here and to see the badge your wife had so many years ago. It's always exciting to think about that unique solidarity and support which we all felt from American Jewry. For me, it is very easy because, first of all, for the first 20 years of my life, I didn't know what is Pesach and what is Seder. And then when we returned through Israel, after 1967, we went back to our identity. and started really studying in the underground about our history and about our faith. And then the first Seder in my life was when I was 24 years old. And three teachers of this underground Ulpanim, 4 or 5 students in each of them, brought all the students in one apartment. And nobody could really read all the Agadah or could understand all the words. So everybody prepared 2 or 3 sentences. But when it comes to B'chol Dor V'Dor, in every generation, they're trying to defeat, to destroy us. It was so easy to feel it. It's enough to look out of the window and to see all these KGB who were following some of us in those days. So, and later even in the punishing cell when I was alone, but it was easy to decide that these 3 pieces of bread, dried bread, it is my matzah, these 3 cups of hot water, it's my it's matok, and salt is maror. That's all what I can have there. And to try to remember every phrase, and again, the phrase that today we are slaves, but tomorrow we will be free people in Jerusalem. That was the feeling. That's why when I did come to Israel, first of all, we now have with our family those first Seder, which we have 3 weeks before the general Seder, is day of my release. And we were telling to our girls and now to our grandchildren the story of their parents. And they every year they are asking questions. First they start asking questions about what animals were your friends in the prison, and then how you knew what's happening, and then how their mother could mobilize all the world, what it means Jewish solidarity. And so they grew with this. And then now our grandchildren are growing with the stories. So after 3 weeks later, when you have said about our exodus from Egypt, so these miracles are almost daily life. So here it comes very natural. And I think it's very useful to remind ourselves, and it is easy to do it to your wife, probably to you and to many others, that it is in our generation, by our own hands, we, with the help of God and the state of Israel, we repeated the miracle of Exodus.
Gil, how were you involved with Soviet Jewry growing up and long before you met Natan?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you, and you're a real hero for so much of what you've done in writing and in advancing the intellectual conversation and the civil conversation in the Jewish world today. So thank you, Abe. Yeah, I was a good Jewish citizen. So like everyone else, I marched at Solidarity Sunday, and we would occasionally skip school and stand outside. I grew up in Queens, go to Manhattan and stand outside the Soviet consulate yelling, "Let my people go, shlach et ami." But the truth is, we didn't really believe it would work. We were doing it to be good people, but it was really interesting in the process of writing the book with Natan and getting to know Avital. They knew from the inside about the weakness of the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, we knew that the United States was on the way down and the Soviet Union was on the way up. And we thought the Soviet Union would last forever. And I was even in the Soviet Union in 1985. And that's actually where I started to see the weaknesses. That's where I started to see the internal chaos. And I was there indeed for Pesach. And so since 1985, we've also often at our Seder had a little Seder plate to memorialize the Seder that I had in the Soviet Union, where we too we didn't have maror, we just had a lot of bitterness. And it's really a goosebump moment every Seder when I think of the matzah of hope we always had on our Seder tables, when I think of the bracelets that we had around our wrists. And now they're our heroes in Israel, they're our friends, they're our colleagues, they're our teachers. No one believed it would happen. And it really should be an important lesson to the next generation that you can make a difference and that working together, Jews and non-Jews, Israelis and diaspora Jews, we're really able to make a revolution.
You know, I was, I'll save most of the audience questions for later, as I said, but I did have one question that was relevant right now. Tammy from LA notes that her friends who are 2nd and 3rd generation Russian Jews in America seem almost deliberately not interested in this story. Is that true in Israel too? And if so, or if not, why?
Well, I think people today's life is full of events, full of developments, full of new challenges. If there is no special effort in the family to keep your connection with the past, it disappears. And that's why, well, in the case of the struggle for Soviet Jewry, it's so easy, it is so natural to tell to the people the story that not something what happened thousands of years ago, not something what happened hundreds of years ago, but really by far the biggest totalitarian, the most powerful totalitarian regime in today's world. And here are Jews who are returning back to their identity in Soviet Union and in America and become very enthusiastic. And of course, the existence of Israel makes a lot of change. And they're defeating this empire. And so the only way to make those second and third generation interested in it, if their families will share their stories with them. And there's so many families which can share these stories. So that's what I can tell. Gil,
And if I may add, part of the impetus in writing the book was not only to speak to the next generation of Russian Jews, but to speak to the next generation of British Jews and Canadian Jews and American Jews and Australian Jews whose parents and grandparents haven't told that heroic tale. And we actually want to challenge the older generation when they sit around this Seder table, tell your story. Tell what you did for the Soviet Jewish movement. Tell what you did to find richness in your Jewish life. And I'm also happy to say that we've recently signed contracts to translate the book into Russian, and we're about to sign a contract to translate into Hebrew too, because we don't just want this to be an Anglo-Jewish tale. We want this to be a world global Jewish tale.
So, so let's get into the book. Somewhere you joke that you considered calling it 999. What's the significance of 999?
It's not a joke. That's what they wanted. Gil, you tell the story.
We literally signed a book contract with Hachette of Public Affairs, which is a serious New York publisher, for 999. And that is the structure of the book, right? Natan likes to say, I was 9 years in Gulag. I was 9 years in Israeli politics. I was 9 years in the Jewish Agency. He sometimes says, I don't know where I suffered most. And if I quote him, he usually says in politics. But the problem I always had with 999 was, first of all, you can't have a title that's an inside joke.
Right.
Secondly, I wanted the book not only to be read by Jews, and I didn't want some of our Christian friends to see 999, maybe they'll see it upside down, think 666 and the devil. And our German friends would go, 999, wow, it's too negative. Mm-hmm. So I'm sitting in Los Angeles with one of your peers, David Suissa of the LA Jewish Journal. And I tell him, we're looking for a title. He says, well, tell me a little bit about the book. And I tell one of the extraordinary stories from Natan's 9 years in the Gulag, when the Soviet KGB, the secret police, are constantly telling him, you're abandoned, you're forgotten, you're alone. And he says, I knew I was never alone. And Suissa goes, that's it. For 75 years, we've been obsessed with never again. And of course, we honor our Holocaust martyrs and we revere them. We don't want to negate them. But we cannot just build an identity on anti-Semitism, on anti-Zionism. We have to have a positive vision. And what better positive vision to say to the next generation of Jews, the power of the Jewish people is wherever you are, whoever you are, when you're a part of this extraordinary network, you're never alone.
Yeah, that's very powerful. So let's go back to the beginning. At one point, Natan, did you realize you were deeply connected or could be deeply connected to the Jewish people? After all, you're a chess prodigy and then a talented young scientist. Even as a Jew with those disabilities, there's a good chance that you would have succeeded in the Soviet Union at some level if you had just kept your head down. What made you into a dissident?
Well, the change was not between chess player and dissident. The change was between loyal Soviet citizen and free person. Because what was loyal Soviet citizen? From my childhood, I didn't have freedom and I didn't have identity. There was nothing Jewish in my life except from anti-Semitism. And then anti-Semitism was a lot. Anti-Semitism in the street and discussions at home all the time that because you're Jewish, such and such careers are closed for you. These positions you can never reach. These are the dangers. And the message is that because you're Jew, you must be number one in your class in physics, mathematics, chess, doesn't matter what. But that is the survival of Jewish people. So you don't have any values except on the value of physical survival. And you know very well that there is no freedom. Well, I have stories how very early you find out that all the life around you is public life is all lies, but the truth can be said only in the family. And so you have double life, this double thing, and it's very uncomfortable. And so to escape, because you're born with such a disease, which is called Jew, that's what's written in the idea of your parents Jew, and there is nothing positive in it, only how to survive with this disease. So you have to escape in some tower of relative freedom. For me, the first escape was chess. That's from the age of 5, when I learned it, my mother told me, that's where you can fly with your thought. And that's the world where your initiative is not punished. So it was really first escape, but that's on the game. Then there was attempt to escape in the castle of science, and a few years were spent to get in the most difficult for the Jew to reach prestigious institute. But then you still continue a double life. And only when, after 67, when everybody around you looks on you and says, how you guys did it, this huge humiliation to Soviet Union that Israel defeated its allies. And you understand that you have really to learn more about this country, that all the world thinks that you're connected. And only when you start really studying in the underground, rediscovering your history, you think, my God, that can be your history. And all these people who are coming from different parts of the world and say, oh, your father is from America, and my from Odessa, and my father is from Odessa. We are family, we want to help you. This Jewish family, and this state which is ready to send airplanes to the end of the world to help you. That's when you discover that you can have identity. That gives you sudden strength to start speaking your mind freely. And the moment you say that, I really don't want to live in this country, I want to go to Israel, of course, your life all changed, and there is a lot of repressions. And it's the end of your career. But for the first time, I can speak freely, and that is the moment of real liberation. And that's what gives you strength to start fighting for your freedom, for freedom of other Jews, and then for freedom itself. That's how I became activist of human rights movement and the Zionist movement.
That, well, there's so much to unpack there, but let's start here. As Daniel Gordis, who reviewed your book for the forthcoming issue of the Jewish Review of Books, it'll be out soon, points out, doublethink is really a key concept throughout the book. So can you say a little bit about what doublethink is, and is it only restricted to Russia, or is it a more general problem?
Well, I wanted to save time and not to tell the story, but really it's very powerful. I started the life of loyal Soviet citizen at the age of 5. When Stalin died, I'm 5 years old. Father explains to me and my elder brother, who's 7 years old. He explains us that it is very good for Jews, for Jews, that Stalin died, because there was a big danger for us. He doesn't go into the details. That is the highest moment of the persecution of Jews, of doctor's trial, of preparation of massive evacuation of Jews from the big cities. But here Stalin dies. But he says, don't tell it. Remember all your life that what a miracle happened. But don't say to anybody, do what everybody does. And I go back to kindergarten. And I cry together with all the children about Stalin, death of Stalin. And I sing together with all children about son of all the people Stalin. And I have no idea how many children are really crying, or how many children are crying because their father said. That is the double life, which you start from the age of 5, and then you continue all your life. Because if you want to have a career, if you want to have a good vacation in the summer, anything, you have to pretend that you are loyal Soviet citizens. And it's very enslaving. It's very unfortunate. Only when you get rid of this doublethink, you understand what a slave you were, what a terrible, miserable life it was. And for me, it was clear that that's part of dictatorial regime. So now imagine the shock which I had when many, many years later, as a minister of Israeli government, at the time of Second Intifada, when Israel is facing terrorist attacks within Jerusalem, so many of our friends are victims of terrorist attacks, and we in the government are discussing every day how to fight against this terror and to save the world. I go to many universities in America, and there are those who are very much on our side. There are those who are very much against us. As one said, as a liberal Jew, I'd prefer that Israel doesn't exist. Why should they have all this criticism? But there are many who prefer not to speak their opinion. When one girl, 25 years old, a young woman says to me that she wanted very much to sign petition defending Israel, but she knows that 3 professors of her will not like it, and it can have influence on her career. She decided to be silent for the next 2 or 3 years, saying, my God, it's not in Moscow at the times of Stalin or Brezhnev. It's not in my university. It's in Harvard Business School in America that some Jews are afraid to say what they really think. And then it became more and more broad phenomenon. Now it's not only about Jews, about Israel. I think there is poll that counter poll that 62% of American Jews prefer not to speak publicly about their political views. So I think that what kind of political views they have doesn't matter. But it matters, of course, but that's part of democracy. The fact that so many people prefer not to speak publicly about their political views, that's something which should alarm free society immensely.
And that, by the way, was one of the low moments in our writing the book. When I shared that poll with Natan, that 62% of Americans, not just Jews, 62% of Americans now are checking their opinions and not honestly expressing them because they fear either totalitarian bullying from the right or cancel culture from the left. It's not limited to one party or another. Imagine what it is for me as a proud American historian to explain to this refugee from the Soviet Union that in the United States of America today and throughout the West, thanks to what I call Twitter dumb, D-U-M-B, there's this bullying culture which isn't allowing democracy to flourish. And to get to the core of your question, what we're pointing out is that, yes, in the Soviet Union, it came from the top down. But the scary thing about what we're seeing today is that doublethink is coming from peers, from professors, as you well know, from authority figures, from social media, and that's toxic. You know, I like to say that one of the crazy things about our partnership is that I was born in the vast shopping mall called the United States of America. Natan was born in the vast prison camp called the Soviet Union. In the 1980s, I was at Harvard University studying American history. Much of the 1980s, he was in the Gulag. And then he likes to pipe in, yes, that means that I suffer from moral confusion. In the Gulag, he had moral clarity. And despite that, despite those differences, ideologically, we're very much on the same page. We argued while writing this book lovingly. It was a real chavruta. We argued about tone, we argued about structure, we argued about wording, but ideologically, we remained on the same page. We share a love of the Jewish people. We share a love of the Jewish state, Israel, the Jewish democratic state of Israel, and we also share a love of freedom. And that's what animates the book.
Again, and I want to emphasize, I'm not speaking now about the danger to democracy. I'm speaking about the danger to the freedom of people. That after all, freedom begins from inside you. If you are afraid to speak publicly about your views, you're not a free person. And it depends only on you. It doesn't depend on KGB. It doesn't depend on Chinese dictators or on Putin. It depends only on you to be a free person or not.
That leads again to a question that many people ask that I was going to say for later, but since you mention it, you did spend 9 years in the Gulag under conditions that hard for a person like me to even imagine. But right now there's Alexei Navalny in Russia and Jimmy Lai in China, to mention just two of the most prominent dissidents who are being jailed by totalitarian regimes. Do you have well, there's two kinds of advice: advice for us, how to help them, but also advice for them. How do they, if it can somehow reach them, this advice? How do
Well,
they sustain?
thank you for asking. In fact, I had 3 long conversations with Jimmy Lai in the last month before he was arrested. And it is 72 years old, the head of the biggest newspaper, the very powerful person in Hong Kong, who was waiting that he'll be arrested and maybe will spend the rest of his life in prison. And that's why he reached me and wanted to discuss, to share experiences. And well, of course, we had very interesting conversations. I had to say, I discovered that I'm dealing with an absolutely free person, and the fear of arrest doesn't control him. So he is ready for this. And no doubt he's a very courageous person. And to fight for him, not to help him, but to, if we really want to protect our free world, we have to understand that these people like Jimmy Lai or Navalny or other democratic dissidents, they are those who are bringing this message to the other people. We are not afraid. Why should you be afraid? But with Navalny, I didn't have an opportunity to talk before he was arrested. But there was a stupid question on Israeli radio. He must be really very not a clever person. Why he doesn't go back? I said, well, if you think that the aim of the life is simply to prolong your physical life, then it's very stupid. But he wants really to challenge the regime. And the only way to challenge the regime is that people will stop being afraid. And his message is, I'm not afraid of them. I'm a free person. Why you should be afraid of them? And hundreds of thousands of people in Russia went to the streets to in solidarity with him. That's why people like Jimmy and Navalny are very dangerous for the dictatorial regimes. And they are those who are the real allies of the free world. And it is very important that free world will speak on their behalf.
If I can add 2 goosebump moments that I had while writing the book also are: one, Natan has this theory which he developed in his book, The Case for Democracy, that the big problem with a dictatorship is a fierce society, and the dissidents are the ones who break out of that. And that's why there's such a threat to the regime. And he's describing it, we're talking about it, and I find a book from the Arab Spring, Voices from the Arab Spring. And one testimonial after another used almost the exact same language that Natan uses to describe his escape from fear and from doublethink and the escape of others. And you saw this really is a kind of universal phenomenon. This isn't some theory cooked up by a political scientist. This is the real life experience of what it's like to live under a dictatorship. And then just a few months ago, I actually watched the hour-long meeting between Natan and Jimmy Lai. It was online, and now actually it's hard to find online. And again, it was fascinating because 2 people who've never met are speaking the exact same language. And when you hear someone like Jimmy Lai say exactly what Natan said when he was in the Soviet Union, which is, I have no choice but to be free. And I can't run away from this because Jimmy Lai has millions of dollars. He has a British passport. He could run away. And to also see this moment where Natan, having been through 9 years in the Gulag, is now on the other side of freedom. And Jimmy Lai, who spent his entire life in freedom and now might spend the rest of his life in jail, was just deeply, deeply moving.
Natan, on that exact point, I remember actually, you probably don't remember this, 10 years ago, you wrote an article for the Jewish Review of Books at the time of the Arab Spring. And part of your argument there, as has been your consistent argument, was that those who say in American foreign policy and in Israeli foreign policy that the important thing in places like the Arab world, and not only the Arab world, is the stability of the regime, and one shouldn't interfere in internal affairs. And you were arguing that this was a great moment of hope, not only for the world, not only for the Arab world, but for Israel, the possibility of interacting with regimes which were not under various kinds of tyranny or dictatorship. But recently, the Abrahamic peace accords seem to be, at least from the outside, somewhat the opposite of this. That is, they are agreements with stable, what one can, monarchies, dictatorships,
Okay.
and so on. What do you think about these?
Okay, great question. Because that's the topic which comes back again and again, and I have to say, to the credit of Biden administration, they are bringing back, at least in the statements, they're bringing back the language of human rights and linkage to foreign diplomacy after 12 years of Obama and Trump, that we didn't hear this. It's simply even language of human rights disappeared. But look, for free world, it's better. It's much better to deal with democracy, simply because when you're dealing with democracy, when you're signing agreement with democracy, you're signing agreement with all the people. And when you're signing with the dictatorship can at any moment it has to control their people, and at any moment they can decide that they turn from friends to enemies. And there is no early warning because they simply have another system of interest. But you cannot export democracy. The idea that America can bring by force to any country democracy, but people in that country, they stop being afraid. That first it's dissidents, and then the revolution is happening when hundreds of thousands are crossing this line between doublethink and dissent. And also what the world can do is to express solidarity. The world can help to build civil society if there are people who are building it. And that's what the problem. That's why when President Obama is blamed why he betrayed Mubarak. Well, here just now, Gil was quoting the book, how suddenly thousands and millions of Egyptians stopped being afraid of their dictator. So American president can stand between them and the president and say, no, I will defend it. On the other hand, when Iranian people went already on the barricades, we were ready to have a revolution. American President Barack Obama says no, engagement with the regime is more important than changing of the regime. So nobody asked him to send troops. The only thing is to express solidarity and say that we are fully with you, and that's what was like. Now you go to Abraham Accords. I believe it's historical development. It's beginning of real peace process, and we write a book a lot against so-called peace process of Oslo, which was something opposite. Why it is so different? Because it doesn't put under the control of some dictator that we export the people. Yes, these countries are not democratic, but the agreement with them, it's not like agreement with Egypt or Jordan. It includes opening of all the doors for the context of people. If until now, after 40 years of the agreement with Egypt, the actor, the singer who will dare to come to Israel with the gospel will be lynched in his own country. Here, there is a competition. Who will be the first actors? What will be the first films made together? The businessmen are competing to have a lot of business. The beginning of civil society context goes very broad. I think it already includes a number of Palestinian businessmen who, for the first time, can build their businesses independently from Palestinian Authority, which was like dictatorship imposed on them. So yes, if there is chance for these accords really to become absolutely new chapter in the Middle East, is because from the beginning it includes very broad context between people and in fact building civil society institutions.
let's jump a little to the third nine of your career, to the Jewish Agency. Probably won't regret not having to talk about Knesset so much. Uh, what was the greatest success and what's the greatest failure during your or disappointment during your time there?
Well, I think a greater success, it was like very logical conclusion of all what I was doing in the previous years, was to change the philosophy of this huge organization, which was created, in fact, before the state of Israel, in order to be like the government of Israel, which didn't exist yet. And after creation of the state of Israel, became responsible for bringing Jews to Israel. And so naturally, historically, the main motto of Jewish Agency was to bring as many new immigrants as possible. And the mission of our shlichim, of those who we are sending to the world, is to knock in every day door to say to Jews, why you're here, why you're not coming to Israel. The fact that, and it is a huge organization with a lot of power, with a lot of connections. The fact that, and so to move it even in one degree, it's very difficult. But the fact that we succeeded to prove that at the time of Aliyah, it's not Aliyah from pogroms, it's Aliyah of free choice. That if you want to have big Aliyah, you have to have more connected Jews. And if you want to fight successfully against anti-Semitism, you must have more connected Jews. And if you want to fight against assimilation, more connected Jews. So the thing is the connection between Jews of Israel and Jews of diaspora. And that was like a very big ideological change, which changed the nature of shlichut, which changed the nature of the many programs which were competing with one another, which brings more olim. Now they are naturally connected with one another. And I'm very glad that that continues. In fact, we moved to the new type of relations between Jews of diaspora and Jews of Israel. And if in the beginning I was accused by some people in the government that it's almost anti-Zionist, that I'm turning the Jewish Agency into kind of ministry of tourism, that people don't have to make aliyah, they only have to visit the tourists. At the time it was understood that that is the best answer for increasing aliyah, and aliyah only increased as a result, and to defend Israel, to fight anti-Semitism, so on, strengthening our family through direct contacts on many levels. That's my failure was, well, we write a lot about it. For 4 years, on the request of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and with his enthusiastic support, I initiated and dealt with the negotiations between the leaders of non-Orthodox movements and Israeli government and the rabbi of the Kotel about the egalitarian place for prayer, how to make sure that everybody can pray near the Kotel with his or her prayers, with his or her rabbis, with his or her community. And we had quite a, it was 4 years of difficult negotiations and many new bridges or new understandings between the leaders of non-Orthodox movement and the Prime Minister of Israel were built. And then after it was already approved, Prime Minister gave up to the pressure of ultra-Orthodox elements, being afraid for the stability of the coalition, and retreated from them, but of course created a lot of new distrust, or let's say the achievements of those years and more understanding, okay, were lost, and we had to rebuild this trust again and again.
On that issue, I cheated and I read the questions, and one person actually severely mischaracterized Natan Sharansky's 18 years both in the Israeli Knesset and in the Jewish Agency. And I would like an opportunity to respond. First of all, I want to thank him for saying what he said, because one of the themes of our book is dialogue, and we need to learn to disagree amicably.
I should
But
say, by the way, that I saw, sorry to interrupt. I saw that question too. I don't know whether I would have asked it. There are so many.
right, that's why I wanted to make sure. I wanted to make sure that, because you're probably too polite. I'm not so polite. I'm a Jew from Queens.
So I would
And,
just
and
say,
I want to address it directly, which is
I'll
the
just say
claim
one,
is.
one,
Go.
one thing. I won't mention names, although I'll mention names on some, but not in this case. That it's a rabbi from one of the non-Orthodox movements, I presume, who is asking this question to which you
And the claim in the question is, and I think I'm quoting accurately, that you did everything you could to deny the rights of Reform and conservative Jews in your years in the Knesset and in the Jewish Agency. So first of all, my email is giltroy@gmail.com. Rabbi, I invite you, send me your address and I will send you a copy of the book. And I challenge you to read the book and to see how many times during the 9 years that he was in Knesset, with all the political craziness, with all the left-wingers as well as right-wingers making deals with the Haredim, Natan Sharansky tried to be a bridge, tried to be a civilizing force, reached out to his friends in the Reform and conservative community. Was he always popular with them? Did they always agree? Of course not. But was there always a dialogue and was always civility? Absolutely. And so to say he did everything he could to deny, that's the easy part. But more than that, especially over the Kotel, and for many, many years, Natan Sharansky was the voice of the Israeli government, the voice around the cabinet table saying, no, we have to remember that we are one united Jewish people. And one of the things he's told me again and again is that when he actually would push almost every single person around that table and say, do you still think that Israel should be a Jewish state for all the Jewish people? They would admit, yes, they would. They believe in that commitment. And so we want to, you want to debate the issue of liberal Judaism in Israel. I would actually say also join us in the struggle, because I every day am doing my best to make sure that in Israel, every single Jew has freedom of religion. And I'm very proud of the Supreme Court for taking the lead. And I'm very embarrassed by my prime minister and many of my leaders who haven't done enough. So join us in this fight, but join also Natan Sharansky in the fight. And please, please, please don't spread that libel.
Okay. In any way, there is always truth on both sides. And I tried to be true to the truth of the other side too. So this rabbi can check with the leaders of his movement and find out, whatever this movement is, how often they enjoyed my partnership and leadership. On the other hand, no doubt, very often I had to present the voice of Israeli government, arguing with them too. Yeah.
Before we get to other questions from our audience, one thing that struck me in reading this book, and it is a great read, is that it's also a love story. Not only a love story between you and the Jewish people, which it is, but a love story between you and your wife Avital. And so my last question will be just: would you like to say something about what it took for her to get you out?
Well, you know what? When she left one day after our chuppah, it was very dramatic event. Those who not want to know the details can read it in the book. But when I took her to the airport in the morning after the evening of our chuppah, and we hope that in a few months we'll be together, she was very, very shy girl. She spoke a few words probably in English, a few words in Hebrew, no words in English. When I met her 12 years later, she was already leading the demonstrations of hundreds of thousands. She opened the doors of practically every leader of the Western world. And still she was a very, very shy woman. And in fact, one of the first things that she said, now I don't need to be a spokesman, now you're a spokesman. And she disappeared from public eye because it was not a natural place for her. But, maybe one story, which is also in the book, I'll mention simply as an example. When she was when I was on the long hunger strike and my life was in danger, she was very concerned. She spent a lot of time in America on Capitol Hill with all the important politicians. And then she gets news that Soviet delegation is going to meet with Margaret Thatcher. And immediately she says that she wants to have a meeting, and the Jewish circles immediately find out the telephone of David Wilson, who is the secretary of Margaret Thatcher, and calls him. And she says, and she tells that she will come tomorrow to London. Her husband is in a very bad situation in prison. She wants to meet Margaret Thatcher. He said, do you know what's the time? She realized that in London it's probably 2:00 at night. She apologizes, I'm sorry, I didn't notice, but, and again and then he started shouting. He said, what do you think about yourself? The heads of the states are coordinating such meetings for months. And you think really that that's the most important thing to speak about your husband? How dare you? And then when she also made a deep breath, and she said, yes, I think that is the most important thing now for the free world, what's happening with Soviet Jews and what's happening with my husband. And maybe Kadosh Baruch Hu put you in this place exactly in order to organize this meeting. And then she flies to London. And in the airport, the big limousine is waiting for her. And David Wilson is there, and he apologizes, and she apologizes, and he takes her to Margaret Thatcher, and she has with her 5:00 tea, and then she meets with Soviet ambassador, Soviet delegation, and says everything what has to be said by him. So she had to do it for 9 years, and she was doing it. No doubt that the fact that she as Rabbi Shvain, Rav Kook personally supported, in fact, initiated the support struggle, supported him. It gave her a lot of strength. But also, of course, this feeling that we are really in this depth of this historical struggle, and what will happen to her husband, what will happen to Soviet Jewry, that what will happen with the world. And there are some people in Washington who were telling me with amazement. She was telling us all the time, like crazy woman, that the moment her husband will be out, the others will be out, Soviet Union will fall apart. It was clear for us that she's crazy. Well, it happened to be absolutely true.
So let's go to a few questions from the audience. Jonathan Forstad asks, did the KGB ever explain or admit to you why they kept you alive and ultimately released you?
Well, look, they didn't have to explain. They cannot explain. They cannot recognize how they're afraid of these dissidents and how important it is to show to the Soviet people that nobody can speak against this power. And that's why they put in the efforts of all this empire to make these few hundred people to say publicly that they are right or we are wrong. And the second thing, and that's what we knew all the time, and that was the strategy on what we built our strategy, that Soviet Union, which seems so powerful, is very weak from inside. And that's my friend Andrei Amerik predicted in 1969, he wrote the book, if the Soviet Union will survive until 1984. And that being such a weak economic, because the country of 200 million slaves, it's very non-productive, it's very weak from inside. It will need a lot of support of the West. And that's why all this policy of linkage between our fate and the most global interests of the Soviet Union was so important. And that's why solidarity of all these Jews was so important. When we went on demonstration of 10 people for 5 minutes, that's maximum what can be done. There was no power in it. But next day, we are arrested. But next day, hundreds of thousands of Jews of America and other countries go on their demonstrations, press their people. And Congress and Senate passed their resolutions linking the interests of the Soviet Union. And I felt it all the time that they are afraid that by, on one hand, they want to force us to say publicly that they're right. On the other hand, they're afraid to damage too much the strategic interests of the Soviet Union. And it was only the question of time when they will be in such a corner that they will start trading us, what means start opening the gates of the Soviet Union.
It's a very important question, which actually framed our writing, because right as I was starting to write this book, my son Yoni read Fear No Evil. And he asked the same question. He said, why didn't they just shoot him? And one of the things I realized was, first of all, that to this generation, the only dictators they know are either Nazis or Hollywood villains. And they don't know the complexity of the Soviet Union and the game the Soviet Union was trying to play with the West, with Westerners, with academics, with the world. And the second thing is that when we talk about the difference between this classic prison memoir, Fear No Evil, and our book, Never Alone, is that when it came out in 1987, everyone kind of knew the rules of the Soviet Union, or thought they did. And one of the things we tried to do in this book was explain what I call the historian's favorite text, context, and explain exactly what was going on in that world, in that alternative universe, which now thankfully has disappeared, although of course it's reappeared in various forms, including in some of our local campuses.
So I'm going to combine two questions, one of them from David Maram. You actually met with Vladimir Putin, who after all had been a KGB agent. What was that like, and how do you foresee the relationship between Israel and Russia?
Well, yes, I did meet with Putin first time, but he was the head of FSB, KGB, and I met him as an Israeli minister interested in the questions of anti-Semitism. And I have to say that at that meeting, I understood that here we have a new type of leader, because usual, typical answer of Russian leaders was, no, we have no anti-Semitism. And I'm bringing with some statements of some powerful Russian officials. He said differently. He said, well, we have stupid people too, what I can do, but you can be sure that I, as the head of FSB, will not permit Jewish pogroms because I'm afraid of them more than you. I said, how it can be? Because for you, it's only beating some Jews. It's of course unfortunate. For me, it means that we are not of the control. Can you imagine what will happen with our country if people will decide that they can take power in their hands? So that's my concern. First of all, I thought that it's a much more frank answer. Then when he became the president, he, on his own initiative, a number of times I met with him, because he hoped, and he said to me frankly, I believe it was a big mistake of the Soviet Union that that they thought that independent Jewish life in the Soviet Union is a danger for them, and they tried not to permit it. I believe that Jews, first of all, he told me stories how Jews were important in his childhood. So, and then he told, I believe that Jewish independent life in Russia can be very important bridge for the West. That was his idea for this. That's why he initiated this meeting. I have to say that since then, 20 years passed, and I don't meet him already for many years simply because all he did was democracy. And of course, many things which we discussed, he was lying about Iran, about Syria, he was lying. But what he said about his attitude to his support of the independent life of Jewish communities, it continues until this day. And I can tell, as the head of Jewish agency, whenever we had and we have a huge operation in Russia, whenever we had problems in some corrupt local authorities or something, always appealing to the Moscow was helping. And his attitude to Israel is that it is a Jewish Russian-speaking state. And he liked it. He liked it. Now, having said all this, as a democratic dissident, I can say that only bad things about him. He took Russian democracy back in many ways. The independent court stopped existing. Corruption became unbelievable. What's happening with the leaders of opposition, Navalny is the last example. So there is a lot of things to condemn. But it's specific, maybe it's first time in the history of 1,000 years history of Russia that the leader of the state is not against Jews. In some way, he is personally very sympathetic to Jews. It shouldn't. We should not have any illusions when it comes to their interests in Iran or some other places. He will not think twice to support our enemies.
Let's end on a more positive note with a question from Beth Chessier. I hope I'm pronouncing that last name right. Who asks, what is the best advice to give when we are faced with the lack of unity in the Jewish community, especially compared to the 1970s? I assume she means the unity around Soviet Jewry, although.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think in our book we are speaking about it, and I spoke a number of times about it was only illusion. The Soviet Jewry movement was unity of all Jewish people. There were many competing Jewish organizations, Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, and Conference for Soviet Jewry, and Coalition for Soviet Jewry, and Conference for Soviet Jewry, and many others. And they were competing, they were refusing to talk to one another, to compare notes with one another. And there were many consequences of this, and we write about it in the book. On the other hand, for KGB, it was one big struggle. And when you are sitting in the prison, it doesn't matter from what organization those people that I was meeting were coming, because they were all part of one struggle. And that's maybe it is good that we had so many disagreements, because it permitted to many of these different groups to reach all parts of Jewish people. So we should not try to have one voice, but we do have to remember all the time that there are things which unite us. Our desire to be together in this journey through history has to be stronger than all our disagreements. And we write a lot about it. Gil, what do you think?
When my wife, 4 children, and I made Aliyah about 10 years ago, Natan was the head of the Jewish agency, and we were friendly, but we weren't close friends. And I nevertheless wanted to have some kind of ceremony for my kids to mark our Aliyah. And so I requested to meet with him, and I thought it'd be a 2-minute meet and greet. We'd take a photo in his office. But Natan, being Natan, sat us down and looked at my kids and said, do you have any questions? And my kids were at the time 5, 7, 10, like their jaws dropped. And I said, I have a question. I said, you went from being this iconic, this hero of the Jewish people, where everybody said, you're such an inspiration, to when you went into Israeli politics, everybody started criticizing you. And now he tells me that people started saying, you're such a disappointment, have a nice day. How did you navigate that? I said, because the kids have been in Israel already for a few years. We had been there on sabbatical, and sometimes it's difficult. And he looked at my kids and he said, do you love your parents? They said, yes. And he said, do you occasionally have disagreements with them? They said, yes. Do you occasionally really frustrated with them? They said, yes. He said, but your family? They said, yes. And I think that's the theme. We are family. We could sing it, we are family, but also next week, we're all going to sit around. Over 80% of the Jews in America and in Israel are going to sit around and have a Seder. And it might be a slightly different Seder and with different traditions, but we're all going to have Seder. And I think the message that we have to continue to convey is that we have unity without uniformity. The notion of dialogue, the notion of machloket, of disagreement, the notion of diversity of views is essential Jewish value, but so too is unity, not just under pressure, not just under tension, not just because of the anti-Semites, but because we are one people. When you're together, you're never alone.
Well, that's a great note on a perfect note, really, on which to end. I wish both of you a early Chag Sameach, and to all of you listening. Thank you very much for coming. And we'll be back on April 15th with Yehuda Reinhardt's around Yom Ha'atzmaut, talking about Chaim Weizmann. So I hope you join us. In the meantime, keep reading, and thanks again. Bye.
Thank you. And don't forget about Line from Agadah. Today we are here. Next year we are in Jerusalem.
Amen.
Amen.